We'll begin this session again with a 15-minute sitting. So take some comfortable and relaxed posture. Settle into the awareness of your body posture, your sitting posture. Sit and know you're sitting. Sometimes using the phrase, there is a body, is a gentle reminder to settle into the awareness of the whole body posture. And then with that framework, opening to whatever is experienced moment to moment. The body breathing, different sensations, thoughts, sounds, emotions. Can all be held within the framework, there is a body. Pay particular attention to the arising of thoughts and images in the mind. And noticing particularly that moment when you come out from being lost. Notice the difference in the experience of having been lost and the experience of being aware. When you're ready, you can gently open your eyes, re-engage. So there are many aspects of the Buddhist teaching that resonate with our common sense understanding of ourselves and the world. For example, the importance of non-harming as being the ethical framework for living in community, whether it's locally or globally. It's the understanding that all things in our lives are continually changing, and the more we are attached to those things which in their nature change, the more we suffer. And there are so many examples of this. If we're attached to youth, then we suffer as we get older. If we're attached to summer, then we are a little discontented in winter. Even, this is a little more extreme example, but if we're attached to good health, not that we shouldn't work for good health, but if we're attached to it, then we'll suffer even more when the body grows ill. So it's pretty clear and obvious that attachment to what in its nature changes is going to be the cause of suffering. It's obvious, even though we may not always be living it, it's easy to understand. But there's one aspect of the Buddhist teachings which really challenge our entire worldview, challenges the worldview of who we are and the nature of the world itself. And this is the deep understanding and realization of selflessness, of non-self. You know, in Pali, it's the word is anatta. And it's this realization of non-self or selflessness that really is the liberating jewel of the Buddhist teachings. So the first important understanding in this is that the self is not something that's there that we need to get rid of. The growing understanding is that it's not there in the first place. Rather, the sense of self or the view of self is precisely that. It's a view, it's a concept, it's an idea. And when it's not understood, it keeps us bound up in a lot of difficulty and suffering. So just to highlight this point, I want to read a little teaching from Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was one of the very great Tibetan masters of the last century. So this is what he wrote. The idea of an enduring self has kept you wandering helplessly in the realms of samsara for countless past lifetimes. It is the very thing now that prevents you from liberating yourself and others from conditioned existence. If you could simply let go of that one thought of I, you would find it easy to be free and to free others. So that's a pretty direct statement and teaching about the importance of coming to some understanding in our own experience of what selflessness is. The Buddha gave a very succinct and direct teaching in this regard. And he gave it to his son, Rahula. And he said to Rahula, see everything with perfect insight, with perfect wisdom. This is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. See everything that arises with perfect wisdom. This is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. You know, this simple instruction would be enough if we could actually remember it, you know, as different things arise in the course of the day, in the course of our lives, and all the ups and downs of our lived experience. You know, thoughts arise, not mine, not I, not myself. Difficult emotions arise, not mine, not I, not myself. Even pleasant experiences, not I, not mine, not myself. But of course, even though the instructions are so simple, you know, and they're so direct, it is difficult to remember and to apply when we're in the midst of some turmoil, you know, or in some mind drama, or simply caught up in the forward momentum of our lives. So in today's talk, I want to explore a whole range of ways of highlighting and directing us to the experience, to the lived experience of selflessness. So we perhaps can get a taste of what this understanding is like and how it can transform, you know, our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. So one exercise that I found very helpful in this regard, in this experiential exploration of not self, is something I call from am to is. So this first came to mind when I was reading some teachings by Ledi Sayadaw. That's L-E-D-I, Ledi Sayadaw. And he was one of the great Burmese masters. He lived at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. And in one place he described the manifestation of wrong view. And he gave a whole list of experiences that were wrong view. So this is some of the list. I'm angry. I'm sad. I'm happy. I'm excited. I'm afraid. I'm depressed. I'm bored. I'm interested. And so you get the idea. The list could go on and on. So what was startling to me when I read this, this was the description, a description of wrong view. What was so startling was that this is just our normal way of describing experiences to ourselves. You know, we might be talking to a friend, oh, I'm so angry, or I'm so tired, I'm so restless. It's just our way of communicating and understanding our own experience. So then the question is, what makes this way of understanding, what makes it wrong view? It's not that these emotions or mind states are arising. There's no problem in that. But rather, wrong view is what takes them to be self. It takes them to be I, it takes them to be mine. And so we could think of wrong view as that deeply conditioned pattern in the mind that identifies with, one way or another, identifies with whatever the arising experience is. So the first step, you know, in this particular exercise is to really watch for the felt sense of I am throughout the day. You know, when there's some noticeable discomfort perhaps, or maybe some particularly pleasant sensation. It might be the sense, we might have that sense, oh, my body, or I'm experiencing this. Likewise, you know, when we're just going for a walk and there's a sense, I'm walking. What is that like? What is the experience like when we have this felt sense of I am. You know, we might experience it very strongly in the identification with various emotions, like I just mentioned. You know, if we're feeling angry and I'm so angry, or I'm so sad, or I'm so happy, pay attention to what the experience is like when the I am is what is describing it. Because there's a particular quality to that feeling of being identified with what's arising, to this felt sense of I am. Now, this is really not hard to do, because I am, this felt sense of it, is the default setting of our minds. So for most of the day, this is the framework in which we're living. And that means that we can look at almost any time in the course of the day, you know, and connect with what it feels like, you know, the I am feeling. Then, and so this is the main point of this exercise. In those moments when we're really connecting, oh, I am, I'm walking, I'm eating, I'm angry, I'm sad, whatever it is, right in that moment of recognizing that I am, just change the language to there is. There is anger, there is walking, there is happiness, there is excitement, whatever the experience is. Now, in this moment of transition from am to is, which is the title of this exercise, right in that moment when we transition from feeling I am to reframing it as there is, we might get a very clear sense, although it may be subtle, but I think it will be very clear, of the contraction in our heart, in our mind, when we're confined in that identification with what's happening. When we're in the prison of I am. And then notice what happens just in that moment of transition when we go from I am to there is. I'm walking to there is walking. I'm thinking to there is thinking. I'm angry to there is anger. And I think you'll have a very immediate sense that we go from a quality of contraction, the contraction, you could say the contraction of self, to the spaciousness of selflessness. You know, and it's very visceral. It can be experienced very directly, and it's not difficult. One does not have to be, you know, practicing for 30 years to explore this. I think it's readily available if we remember to pay attention, you know, and really take the opportunities, which can happen many times in a day, because as I said, the I am is the default setting. So almost any time we look, you know, we'll be able to get a felt sense of it. And then to experience the greater ease, the greater spaciousness, when we move from am to is. I am to there is. You know, we've mentioned in the sitting sometimes using the phrase, there is a body, as a way of settling in. I first started using this phrase actually in the walking meditation, where I would just be walking, and not even necessarily super slow walking. I would just be walking, but being mindful. And then I would drop the phrase in, there is a body. It was very interesting what happened, because in going from that felt sense, oh, I'm walking, even if it's not articulated as words in the mind, but we have that sense of it, you know, I'm walking, or I'm doing walking meditation. And then there is walking, there is a body. And using that as the frame, my experience in doing that, it was very dramatic. It went from having even a very subtle sense of the form of the body. You know, it was kind of solidifying the idea of the body in some way. I'm walking. To there is a body in the walking, then the experience became one simply of feeling sensations in space. actually the form of the body completely disappeared. And it was just walking, there's a body, even though we're using that term, the realization goes beyond the form of the body. And we are dropped into the actual experience moment to moment. Simply sensations arising and passing. As I say, sensations in space, and it becomes so easeful. So you might just experiment with this for yourself. I found it really helpful, and that's when I start using this phrase, there is a body, not only in walking, but also in sitting, because it had that same sense of relaxation and opening. Now, some people might think, before they actually explore this, that going from am to is, from I am to there is, might create a kind of detachment or, indifference to what was going on, as if it's kind of a pulling away. But here, it's really important to know understand the difference between detachment and non-attachment. Because in English, the word detachment can suggest a kind of withdrawal from experience. Oh, I'm detached from whatever it is. And it has the implication perhaps of pulling away from. Whereas the term non-attachment does not imply pulling away at all. We're fully there in the experience, but without the added component of being attached to it. We're no longer attached or identified with what's arising. So it's not at all a kind of detached, uncaring space. Everything actually becomes much more immediate, and much more vivid, because we're not clouding the experience with the view or the sense of I am, that felt sense, which, as Lady Sayadaw pointed out, that's really the heart of wrong view. So although this move from am to is really simple, and I'd encourage you to play with it in whatever way interests you, it has profound implications. So again, this is from the teachings of the Buddha. He said, by rightly understanding I am, one makes an end of suffering. The eradication of I am is the attainment of Nibbana here and now. So that's pretty dramatic. It's highlighting how central this whole notion is in the teachings of liberation. It's all about going from am to is, from letting go of this sense of I am. And as the Buddha said, this itself leads to the end of suffering, leads to the realization of Nibbana. Okay, so this is one of the exercises that can begin to give us a sense or a taste, a real experience, of selflessness, of what that actually feels like in our experience. So another exercise, and I'm going to be going through quite a few of them, maybe one or several of them will really capture your interest. So another exercise in experiencing selflessness is what I call dreaming ourselves into existence. So this happened once when I was on retreat. I was doing a self-retreat. And I had a very interesting experience as I was walking. And I was doing walking meditation, but it wasn't even, again, particularly the super slow walking. I was just walking at a somewhat normal pace. But I started noticing just a stream of very quickly passing thoughts. And these thoughts were not problematic, they weren't dramatic, they weren't calling my attention in some very obvious way. It was just kind of this undercurrent, of thoughts that would come and go and pass through. And because they weren't particularly problematic, I hadn't been in the habit of particularly paying attention to them, because they actually passed quite quickly. In this particular time, I just started noticing them. I noticed how frequently they were arising, this kind of undercurrent, even as I was being mindful, pretty much, of the walking and the body. But these thoughts were there, kind of in the background, as I say, undercurrent. And it reminded me of another experience, which I think is fairly common, and probably most of you have had it. You know the experience when you wake up in the morning, and maybe if you don't jump immediately out of bed, maybe you fall back asleep for, a couple of minutes and enter back into a quick little dream state, and then wake up and, then you're fully awake, and engaged. Well, when I saw these quickly passing thoughts in the mind and how I hadn't been aware of them, I realized that every time the mind dropped into being in that thought without mindfulness, without knowing that the thought was there, it was exactly the same experience of dropping back into the dream state after waking up in the morning. Because we're walking, for example, and is sort of like a quick thought comes through, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, however long. And if we're not mindful of it, it's as if we've dropped into the content of the thought, into the mental environment of that thought, unknowingly, because we're not mindful that it's happening. And so it's like dropping into the dream state. And then, after some number of seconds, we come out of the thought, and that's like waking up again. So this became really interesting. And then I noticed one more thing in this particular understanding, that the content of these thoughts, and I want to emphasize, these are just the ordinary thoughts of our daily life. They're not the big dramas, they're not, supercharged. They're just ordinary passing thoughts. But what I saw, as I got interested in this whole phenomenon, was a good percentage of those thoughts was self-referential in some way. Maybe it was my planning for something, or remembering something, or a desire for something. But in some way or other, they were self-referential. So when I noticed that, that's when I started calling this whole phenomenon, Joseph, you're just dreaming yourself into existence. You're dropping into these momentary dreamlike states of thoughts, unknowingly, because we're not picking them up. The mental environment being created is one of I am, some self-reference. And so unknowingly, we're continually reinforcing this felt sense of self, of I. And likewise, I exhorted myself, I noticed that I said, Joseph, stop dreaming yourself into existence. So that became a little bit of a mantra for me on this retreat. I would just remind myself, and it became an impetus, and it was very enlivening, an impetus to really keep an eye out for this level of thought in the mind. So even though didn't feel particularly disturbing, but it was still having a profound impact on the conditioning of our whole inner world, our whole inner environment, how we sense ourselves and feel ourselves. So I hope this is somewhat clear. It was very vivid and dramatic for me to see this, and an ongoing delight in the practice. Now throughout the day, when I remember, of course, I could just be going for a walk or doing, engaging in some activity. And when I remember and keeping an eye out, for these quickly passing thoughts, it really punctuates the day with many, many moments, both of mindfulness and a certain level of the experience of selflessness, because we're no longer identifying with these thoughts and we're no longer conditioning the self-reference involved with them. Okay, so from am to is, stop dreaming oneself into existence. There are a few more exercises that can really help to get a taste, to have a real experience of selflessness, of what non-self means. So again, this happened when I was on retreat. One other reason to go on retreat is just we learn a lot and have all these teaching stories. But they're really impactful. Then that's the beauty of the practice. The Dharma is so vast and so deep. It's a continual learning and opening. So on another retreat, I was just sitting, kind of an ordinary sitting, being in the flow of what was going on. And a phrase from the suttas, the text, came to mind. And it's a phrase that is mentioned very often. So I had read it many, many times, but had never given it, really given it much thought, because it seemed so obvious what it meant. And the phrase that recurs a lot is, before I say it, I'll just mention that in the text and in the stories, very often people hear this phrase and get enlightened. So this may be your big chance. Okay, so this is the phrase. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. I had read this so many times, and it seemed very obvious. It was like a simple, obvious statement of impermanence. And so I would read it and acknowledge, yeah, that seems true, and never really did much with it. But on this particular retreat, I was just sitting, and for whatever reason, that thought came to my mind, that phrase. But instead of just letting it pass by and kind of acknowledging it on the intellectual level, for some reason, that phrase actually, it dropped into the flow of my changing experience. So it's almost as if it became alive in the whole process. I'm sitting and just in the flow of the sensations of the breath or other sensations, sounds, whatever was arising, but in that flow-like nature. And then right in the midst of that, this phrase, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. And then my mind made a leap to an understanding. Because whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, therefore, there's nothing to want. So that became the key phrase. Therefore, there's nothing to want. And in this particular example, I'm speaking specifically about the wanting, the often and mostly unnoticed wanting in our meditation practice itself. Where we're with the experience, we're with the flow of what's happening. But very often, I see it myself, and I've talked to many, many people about this, very often there is a leaning into the unfolding process. We're with this in order for this. We're with the in-breath in order for the out-breath. Or we're with this sensation in order for it to open, or take many, many forms. But it's that experience, and again, this may be on a very subtle level, of wanting something. And the Buddha called this kind of craving for becoming. Right? So this is a much more subtle kind of craving than the one we're more familiar with, the craving for sense pleasures. this is on really the meditative level, the example I'm talking about, craving for becoming. It's this leaning into. Okay, so when, that's this phrase dropped into my mind, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, therefore there's nothing to want. Right in that moment, in the nothing to want, I could feel my mind drop back from the wanting, from the leaning. And it was really quite a startling moment. Because I saw in that moment so clearly that this is really what the practice is about. It's about not wanting, it's about non-craving. When the Buddha described his enlightenment, in the famous house builder quote, or house builder, you will build no house, meaning of self again. And it goes on, the last lines are, realized is the unconditioned, achieved is the end of craving. So the Buddha is highlighting very explicitly that this is actually the fruit of the practice. This is the very essence of awakening, of enlightenment, the end of craving. But for a long time, I had understood that that was, we might say, the goal of practice, but I had put it off into the future. I thought, okay, I'll practice for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, and maybe someday I'll get to the end of craving. But actually, our practice is about seeing that and realizing that right now, moment to moment, we can remind ourselves that our practice is not about getting something. It's about not wanting. And in that moment of the mind dropping back from wanting, oh, there's nothing to want, could feel the peace of that. It was like we could say a taste of the third noble truth, which is precisely the end of craving. So I'd really encourage you just to experiment with this a little bit, because in a fundamental way, it changed my understanding of what our practice is moment to moment, and the immediacy of the possibility to touch that, to taste that, and that itself becomes a great inspiration for continuing. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, and particularly in our meditation process, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, and therefore there's nothing to want. And in nothing to want, the mind settles back, we could say, into openness, into emptiness, into that space of non-craving. There's so many examples, but I'll go to a few others. So we create a strong sense of self also through our attachment and our identification with our views and opinions about things. And the Buddha talked about this, as one of the four great attachments. Attachment to views and opinions. And as I began to explore this, tell a story illustrating just how it became so obvious to me, what was really fascinating is to see how often we have opinions, and not infrequently quite attached to them, about things we know nothing about. But it doesn't stop us from having an opinion about them. So here's an example, and this is what really highlighted the freedom that comes when we're not identified with our opinions and views, when we're not attached to them. So this goes back many years. This goes back to 1974, 75. when I was teaching in the summer session of Naropa Institute. You know, the Buddhist Institute that Trungpa Rinpoche set up in Boulder, Colorado. And in that summer of '74, it was a big event. You know, it was like it was like a Buddhist Woodstock. You know, and people came from all over the country. Ram Dass was there, and Trungpa Rinpoche was there, and many other teachers. And I was there teaching a course in Vipassana, insight meditation. And I was walking around, you know, the area. I noticed a poster for a talk by Dujum Rinpoche, who again is one of the great enlightened masters in the Tibetan tradition. He's the head of one of the great lineages, tremendously revered, you know, as an awakened being. And so the poster said something like, you know, this talk by Dujum Rinpoche, and then it said, incarnation of Sariputra. Now, as many of you know, Sariputra, or in Pali Sariputta, was the chief disciple of the Buddha, second only to the Buddha in wisdom and understanding. But from the Theravada point of view, once one is fully enlightened, once one is an arhat, one no longer takes rebirth. And this is just the commonly held understanding in the teaching, you know, that in the experience of full enlightenment and the uprooting of all craving, this energy for continued rebirth is eliminated. So I've been practicing, you know, for 20, 30 years already within the framework of the Burmese tradition, and this was so embedded in my understanding, you know, that arhats are not reborn. But there's this poster, Dujum Rinpoche, incarnation of Sariputra. You know, and Dujum Rinpoche probably wouldn't use the terminology of arhat, but he was considered a great enlightened being. So my mind kind of went on tilt. You know, how could Dujum Rinpoche be enlightened and still be the incarnation of Sariputta, who was second only to the Buddha in his wisdom, and from the Burmese point of view, certainly did not take rebirth. So this was kind of put my mind on tilt. And then I realized I had a little mini satori as I was grappling with this juxtaposition, you know, of views about Sariputta being reborn or not. I realized that actually I didn't know. I really had no idea from my own experience whether he was reborn or not. All I knew was within the Theravada tradition, they say he certainly would not be. And evidently in the Tibetan tradition, or at least in this one case, it said he took rebirth and Dujum Rinpoche is the incarnation. So I realized that I didn't know. Just that different traditions had different views on this. And when I realized that I didn't know, the great realization was, I don't have to have an opinion about this because it's something I don't know. And it was so freeing. And it became a framework for really looking at the way I hold a whole range of opinions, right? And of course, even if it's something we do know, we can still have it without identification, without attachment, you know, without investing our sense of self in that view or that opinion. And it makes for a much more easeful and harmonious way of relating to people, especially people with other views or with other opinions. You know, it provides some possibility for us to actually hear other perspectives, you know, and maybe broaden our understanding. And particularly, this would be particularly useful maybe in times of difficult interpersonal interactions where it's so easy to get caught up in our viewpoint, of how things are. And that really cuts off the possibility of genuine communication. So this is another place where we create this strong sense of self through identification with views and opinions, and how we can come to another level of understanding selflessness if we let go of that attachment. So now we get perhaps to the most subtle place in the creation of the felt sense of I, of self. And that is our identification with consciousness itself, with awareness. It may well be that you've already had, many glimpses or tastes, or more than that, real, ongoing experiences of the selflessness of sensations, or thoughts, because they're just continually changing. We see that so clearly. Or even sometimes we might have the sense of the impersonality of emotions. That the emotions themselves arise out of conditions. They arise, they're there for some time, and they pass away. And maybe we get glimpses of the non-selfness of emotions. But it's in the identification with awareness, with consciousness, it becomes, or we create the sense of I'm the one who's knowing all this. So even when we become aware, maybe the sensations in the body and thoughts and emotions are not self, but still, I'm the one who's knowing. And so we create a sense of the witness or the observer and become identified with that. Well, that's who I am. So this becomes a challenge to see how can we cut through this identification with consciousness, with knowing, with awareness. So this kind of brings our practice to quite a subtle level. There are a whole range of ways, different angles, different perspectives on how we might begin to cut through this identification with consciousness itself. So I'm going to go through some different possibilities here, and they really come from different traditions within the Theravada tradition, but I think it's also in the later Buddhist traditions as well. One way of understanding, or one insight into the nature of this mind-body process it's called the insight into nama-rupa. And that's translated most generally, although there's some specific details and ways of defining it. But most generally, might think of it as mind and matter, or body and mind. Nama is the mental activity, consciousness included, and rupa is the body form. So in this way of understanding, and one of the insights in insight meditation, one of the stages we go through is where we see that the flow of experience is the pairwise progression of knowing an object. So every moment, these two things are happening. There's a sound and the knowing of it, a sight and the knowing of it, a sensation and the knowing of it, a thought and the knowing of it. And this is what really describes our whole life, that what we call self is simply this pairwise progression happening very quickly, knowing an object, knowing an object, knowing an object, knowing an object. So within this framework, in our meditation practice, as the momentum of noticing builds, and as our refinement of the perception of change gets stronger, so that we're seeing the rapidity of this pairwise progression. Knowing an object, knowing an object, knowing an object, like countless times in a minute. we're actually at certain stages in our practice, we can begin to experience the continual arising and dissolving of consciousness itself. It's arising with its object moment after moment, arising, disappearing, arising, disappearing. And so when we see that the pair is arising and passing away, so then it's a kind of a powerful deconditioning of the habit of identifying with the known, with the consciousness, because we see that it's not steady, it's not stable, it's not permanent in any way. It's arising and passing very quickly. And so that begins very much to weaken this sense of consciousness being I, being self. So this is one way, of really addressing it on a very clear and fine level. So maybe, at different times in your experience, especially when, you feel like you're really in a natural, easeful flow of what's going on, then just see if you can highlight the awareness that what's actually happening is this flow of this pair, knowing an object, knowing an object, knowing an object. And I think you'll begin to get a sense that this insight cuts through the notion of consciousness being self, being I. Okay, so that's one way. Another exercise, which I found really helpful, and this involves a kind of thought experiment. And I became interested in thought experiments, really, and this was quite a few years ago, when I read a biography of Einstein by Walter Isaacson. And it was kind of fascinating, just his life and his mind, And most of his discoveries, his great kind of intuitive understandings, happened through his own thought experiments, about the nature of reality. And in the book, it really highlights that. And it made me appreciate that, this could be a very useful and incisive use of thought in the service of insight, in the service of realization. Okay, so with that as background, in the teachings, when it's describing the conditioned nature of consciousness, it talks about the conditions necessary for a particular kind of consciousness to arise. But just a very simple example. For seeing consciousness to arise, and again, this is not a current scientific anatomical description. It's using the framework, of understanding in the Buddhist times, but it's very relevant, and we can really experience things on that level now as well. So he talked about how there are 4 conditions necessary for seeing consciousness to arise. So it has to be the I, the physical I in working order. There has to be light. It's completely pitch black, we won't see anything. There has to be something coming in front of the eyes, and there has to be attention. So if these 4 conditions are there, seeing consciousness will emerge. Working eye, light, object coming in front of the eye, and attention. So then my thought experiment, and I did this just on a walk, I was going out for a walk and this was coming to mind. So the thought experiment I did was, I said, well, what would happen? Because as I was walking, of course, I was seeing. So I asked myself, well, what would happen? Would I still be seeing if I didn't have eyes? Well, obviously I wouldn't. Or would I still be seeing if there were no light? So in my mind, as this thought experiment, I just started taking away one or another of the conditions. And it became so obvious that you take a condition away, that particular consciousness is not going to arise. So again, it highlighted the conditioned nature of consciousness. And then moment after moment, it's arising because the conditions are there for it to arise. Conditions change, that particular consciousness fades away. This is, again, a powerful, although it might be momentary, but in that moment, oh, it's seeing consciousness arise. If there are no eyes or there's no light, no. And it's like right in that very moment, there was a real sense of the non-self of consciousness, that it's merely another conditioned phenomenon. So the practice of examining Namarupa, the pairwise progression of knowing an object, to really experiment perhaps with the conditioned nature of any particular moment of consciousness, where we see that it's conditioned and not I, not self. So a third way, and this is approaching it from another tradition more in the Zen and Tibetan tradition, but again, a powerful way of just beginning to see the selfless nature of the mind. So there's a well-known Zen story, which I'll share, and it just points to this. But as you listen to it, the story involves, it's kind of like a Zen, it could be heard as a Zen witticism, but don't listen to it in that way, because it's a profound teaching. You know, so often people hear, you know, when they hear the last line, they might laugh or this or that. It's just seeing the humor of almost the language. Pay attention, though, to the meaning of the words, because the meaning is pointing to something really quite profound. So the story has to do with Bodhidharma, who's the person who brought Buddhism from India to China, you know, and this great being. And it said he went to China and he lived in a cave facing a wall for 9 years, and, you know, kind of this great yogi. When the seeker came, you know, who was really suffering, just tremendous suffering in his mind and his heart. And at first, Bodhidharma was just hanging out in his cave, didn't want to come out, but this man entreated him, you know, to please give him teachings. And his name, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the Chinese correctly, his name was Huike, Huike. Anyway, Huike comes to the mouth of the cave, calls on Bodhidharma, and finally Bodhidharma comes out. And Huike says, my mind is suffering so much. You know, I'm so caught. You know, and he was drowning in the suffering in his life. And he said, I'm suffering so much. Please pacify my mind. And Bodhidharma says, show me your mind and I'll pacify it. And Huike says, I've looked for it everywhere and I can't find it. And Bodhidharma then replies, there, it's already pacified. So this teaching I've used a lot. And it really has to do with the exercise of looking for the mind. And find this instruction in some Tibetan teachings that kind of give the same instruction. Can you find your mind? And when we look for it, there's nothing to find. Although the knowing is still there, but it can't be found. So this is the great, in a way, it's the great mystery of the mind. So sometimes, for example, I'll be sitting and I'll do it often with sound. You know, if I'm sitting and hearing arises, because it's so effortless, you know, doesn't take any effort to be mindful, to know that I'm hearing. You know, so it's just sitting, hearing arises, know that I'm hearing. And so then I'll ask myself, can I find what's knowing the sound? And I'll actually, in that moment, I'll actually look. It's almost like turning the mindfulness back towards the knowing. And in doing that, just like Quaker said, I've looked for it everywhere, but I can't find it. So there's nothing to find, even as the knowing is happening. But there's nothing to find. And right in that moment, there is that experience. In the not finding, there's the experience of, oh, already pacified. And now, sometimes, I'll just use that phrase, being very familiar with this little story and verse. Kind of, I've reduced it for myself as shorthand. Just, there's nothing to find, or already pacified. You know? And so sometimes just in the course of my day, if I'm feeling my mind, is upset about something or other that has happened, and I feel like I'm caught in some way. And I remember, I will do just this exercise, and I'll remind myself, I'm already pacified. Or, there's nothing to find. And it reconnects with that experience of looking for the mind and not finding. As one Tibetan Dzogchen teacher said, in describing this exercise, the not finding is the finding. That's what's to be understood, that the mind can't be found. Again, this is just another angle on understanding the selfless nature of awareness, of consciousness. Okay, there's a few more. I know this talk is going on a bit longer, but these things are of interest to me, so I'm hoping they're of interest to you as well. Another way that really transformed my practice significantly in this understanding both of selflessness and of understanding and finding a place of much greater ease in the practice. And that is changing the language that we use to describe our experiences to ourselves. And sometimes the language we use, and I'll give the example of what I mean. Sometimes the language is very explicit and sometimes it's implicit. Usually we understand experience, and now I'm talking about a linguistic convention. We understand experience in terms of the active voice. So in the active voice in language, there's a subject and a verb and an object. I'm going to the store, or I'm listening to music. Or there's the subject, the verb, the object. The passive voice turns that around. So for example, instead of I'm knowing a sound being known. Instead of I'm knowing this thought, a thought being known. Instead of I'm feeling the sensation or I'm knowing the sensation, a sensation being known. So do you see this difference between the active voice and the passive voice? What's interesting, when we use the active voice, it's continually reinforcing the subject of I. And in this way, language is continually reinforcing our sense of self. And in the passive voice, sound being known, a thought being known, in the passive voice, we're removing the subject. There's no subject in that sentence. There's no I. And so we can begin to experience the flow, of what we're knowing, but without our language reinforcing the sense of self in it. So at a certain point, and this goes back quite a few years now, kind of this understanding of how a different way of languaging things could really impact our practice I started using it at first, particularly in the walking. It was very effective in the walking, because when we're doing walking meditation, again, the object is very clear. We don't have to struggle a lot, to locate the object or to find it, or it's not that subtle. It's there's a movement of the feet and the legs, the body. So I started using this passive voice in the walking. And at first I would actually use the phrase, but then when I dropped into that way of understanding it, I didn't need the words anymore. But the words were something like, sensations being known. In the course of taking a step, what is the actual experience? Well, it's the experience of sensations being known. And then maybe sound would arise, sound being known. And then back into the flow of sensations being known. So there's no I in that, there's no self. And what became so interesting was all the qualities that became highlighted in this way of framing experience. So in sensations being known, it became very clear that the sensations are being known perfectly and precisely in the moment of it arising. Not a moment before, not a moment after, something being known spontaneously and exactly in the moment. It became so effortless. There was no one doing anything. It was all happening by itself. Once I set this framework of understanding, so instead of somebody trying to be mindful, and this could be happening on a very subtle level, but still present, then it just became the spontaneous awareness of things being known. And it was happening effortlessly, it was happening by itself. This really took a whole quality of efforting out of the practice. And the day and the practice became so much more easeful. Just dropping in and being in the flow of things being known. Again, I encourage you, if you have any interest in this, to really experiment using that frame. And as I say, at first you might want to actually express it in words, sensations being known or sounds being known. But very quickly, you don't need the words anymore because you're just in that perspective. So to highlight the value of this in terms of cutting through the sense of self, the identification of self with knowing, the great philosopher Wittgenstein, he wrote, "The sense of a separate self is only a shadow cast by grammar." So that was such a clear expression of exactly this change of perspective. That language is powerful. Language very much conditions how we experience things, how we view things. And so this change of language is one way of deconditioning the reinforcing of self through language. So the question really is, how do we integrate the conventional use of self, of I? In our language, in the way we communicate with people, because with all this talk of experiencing non-self, it doesn't mean that we throw away the concept. It's to realize that self is a concept, right? So it's not actually referring to anything that's there. But for the purpose of communication, it's a useful concept. And so we use all the personal pronouns, whichever ones we choose to use. And that's fine. So it's not throwing away the conventional use of the notion of self or I. But we can go underneath that conventional understanding. to the more, we might say, profound realization of how things actually are, which is really the meaning of the word vipassana. You know, in Pali, it's kind of meditation we do. It means seeing things clearly. You know, so as we deepen our practice in this understanding of selflessness, it's tremendously freeing. It's like we're coming out of this the contraction of this view. Because the felt sense of self is quite confining. And we realize that in those moments when we open to the felt experience of selflessness. And we can, as I said, begin to taste it or experience it through any of the ways that I mentioned in this talk. Or if you're interested, you know, you might play with one or more, you know, of these techniques of touching this realization. And it has one further very important implication or manifestation. And again, this is from Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, where he expresses the intimate relationship of selflessness or non-self and compassion. He said, when you realize the empty nature of phenomena, the energy to bring about the good of others dawns uncontrived and effortless. Again, when you realize the empty nature of phenomena, that is the selfless nature, the energy to bring about the good of others dawns uncontrived and effortless. And I love that teaching because for me it highlights one particular aspect of compassion, which I find very powerful. You know, usually we think of compassion as a particular feeling or emotion, which it certainly is. You know, that kind of tenderness of the heart. But the aspect of compassion that I feel in some way is even more helpful to us is the understanding of compassion as responsiveness. Because if we think of it only as a feeling or an emotion, then we might start wondering if we don't particularly feel that, you know, in a strong way. Or does this mean I'm not compassionate? But when we realize, as I said yesterday or the day before, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh saying compassion is a verb. You know, when we understand compassion as responsiveness, then even if there's not some strong emotion motivating us, still in our openness to situations right in front of us, in that openness, this compassionate responsiveness dawns uncontrived and effortless. So this is the great power of our practice and the richness of understanding how the realization of selflessness, of non-self, manifests in the world. So thank you for your attention. There's a lot to say about all of this, but I hope this gave you some tools for really practicing with it, you know, and engaging with the inquiry and the exploration. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Yeah, I feel a lot of gratitude. I want to thank you, or there is a lot of gratitude that wants to be expressed. I think from all of us, and especially I want to name this very vibrant relationship that True North Insight has with you. You know, it was born, I think Daryl, Russ would agree with this, and the others, Norman Feldman, and all those who were there at the creation of True North. You know, it's born a lot from, you know, from your work, and it was a kind of a, we meant it as a sister center to the Insight Meditation Society. So you've been there from the inception, and all along you've been coming, supporting us, and it's very, very appreciated. Most of what I learned from you. Most of what Roxanne is offering also comes from you. And so, yeah, we're extremely grateful. Grateful also, yes, to Roxanne. Thank you so much for bringing your two wings of compassion and wisdom to this retreat. I want to thank Bibiana and Muriel for the managing of the retreat, and Janet, who's been forever in the background. She was in the background at IMS, you remember, Joseph?
Yeah.
And she's there. And the whole community of practitioners. I've seen that other of the teachers of True North were there. Norman and Molly, I noticed, were there, and Jill. And so it's a very vibrant community, and I'm happy that anyone who joins us can feel welcomed in that circle. I also want to say that I think online at IMS in the next few months, you'll be giving some kind of mentoring. So from what I understand, there's going to be 3 times where you'll do an hour-and-a-half Q&A session like you just did today over 3 months. So people can find this information on the Insight Meditation website. At True North here, next week, around the 27th, I think we'll be offering a Black and Indigenous and people of color retreat with Dara Williams, who's a great friend of yours, Joseph, and an excellent teacher. And she'll be with Don Mauricio, also somebody that we are so happy to have at True North Insight. And Josen, Tamari Gibson, will also be there, a colleague of Roxanne and a friend of yours. And so there's this retreat that you can participate in or invite your friends to participate in. And for myself, I'll just plug this in as we're at it. I'll be with you, Joseph, next month with Kamala Masters and Tuere Sala, Rock, for a 4-day retreat, I think. But also from Thursday, this coming Thursday to Sunday, I'll be leading a retreat on my own with the BCIMS, British Columbia Insight Meditation Society. And so you're welcome if you want to continue exploring the Dharma, please join me and the folks at the BCIMS. And voila, Roxanne, maybe you have a few last words that you would like to say?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph and everyone. And yeah, the wheel keeps on turning. If you want to continue practicing tonight, where I'm going to be teaching at 8 in French. So the retreat never ends. It keeps on going and going. And it's a deep pleasure to be practicing with all of you. And we wanted to give the opportunity, maybe just 2 or 3 a participant that would like to just say a few words. So we end this retreat. So maybe you can write to Muriel and say, I would like to just say a few words of how it was for you, or something you want to share. Or maybe it's the wisdom of silence. We just wanted to honor this Sangha that we've created. I'm looking now at the gallery mode and seeing almost 200 of us sitting together. So feeling very grateful for having this time to practice in community, in gathering, and having this ceremony together. So a lot of gratitude for your practice, and wishing that we cross each other's path in the days, weeks, months, years to come. Thank you.
Est-ce que
Oui.
Est-ce que tu as terminé? Okay, I'm going to jump in then. I wanted to just take one moment to mention that these teachings are offered on Dana, and that there is no financial compensation to Joseph, Pascal, and Roxanne for this retreat. So I want to really, say that they rely on Dana actually for this retreat, fundraiser retreat, but still. So I'd like to remind us also that the teachers have been, very much impacted by this pandemic. So really an invitation and such an opportunity to express our gratitude for them. So I wanted to mention that. And maybe on a technical aspect, to also mention that we've created actually on our website in the menu where you see the giving, there is a drop-down menu, and the first thing is the teacher Dana. So if you click on the teacher Dana, you open the page, and then that is where you can offer the Dana to our teachers. Voila. And I wanted to maybe just again say un grand merci, such a big thank you to you, Joseph, and for all the support that you give to TNI, to True North Insight. Merci.
It's been great being with you all. Till next time.
Yay.
Yay.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, Joseph. Bonsoir. And as is becoming almost a tradition, at the end of these retreats, we'll unlock everybody's microphone, and so we can all express of gratitude or whatever we want, and it'll be a big melting pot of voices for a couple of minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Merci.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we can do that tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Be well,
For
everyone.
company being
Thank you.
on.
Well, everyone.
Thank you so
Pascal,
much.
Roxanne, Muriel,
Thank
Viviana,
you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci.
Okay, thank you.
Merci tout le monde.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank
you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well, everyone.
Merci à tout le monde. Au revoir.
Merci, Pascal.
Thank you.
Merci, Roxane.
Hey, merci beaucoup. Je vous aime beaucoup, beaucoup.
Merci tout le monde. Au revoir.
Merci.
Bye.
Bye, Joseph.
Bye.
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 We need to talk to you.
Ai, ce ragazzi bene.
Acabou. Acaba de fechar.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Muriel.
Bye, Agathe.
Bonjour. J'essaye d'écrire un message, mais je ne peux pas. Je suis au Mexique et j'ai eu une panne électrique à la fin de la session de Roxanne. Et donc, je n'ai pas pu écouter Joseph la dernière heure et demie. Est-ce que quelqu'un l'a enregistré ou c'est possible de...
Oui, ça va être, c'est enregistré. En principe, on devrait pouvoir vous l'envoyer. Mais le mieux, ça serait que vous nous envoyez un courriel pour le demander si jamais.
D'accord, d'accord. C'était juste, oui, la dernière partie que j'ai perdue. Ok, merci beaucoup.
Ouais, gracias.
Merci.
Adios, gracias.
Gracias.
Au revoir tout le monde. Au revoir, Muriel.
Bye, Agathe.
Bye, Agathe.
A message.
Ok, bye bye. Merci tout le monde. Bye.
Merci.
Bye. Elle n'est pas là. Allô, Véro. Mm-hmm.